Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the basic guide to MIDI control data in Cubase. Now, control data in the context of what we're going to talk about today is a very specific thing. Firstly, we're not talking about notes, so we're not interested in the pitch of the notes themselves or their velocities. All of that is a separate discussion. I've already dealt with recording MIDI information in Cubase. I'll put a link to that above. Secondly, we're not dealing with automation either. Automation is a very Cubase specific or DAW specific concept that once again has nothing to do with the MIDI protocol, although as you're going to see today, they are very closely related. But let's finally talk about what MIDI control data is. It's basically all of the meta information that surrounds those notes. So now we're talking about pitch bend, aftertouch, foot pedal controls, all of the stuff that you're going to use to enhance or modulate that information over time that is fundamentally stored as MIDI. That's what we're talking about today. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. They're an awesome way to help support my channel so that I can make more of these videos. Okay, let's get some MIDI control data recorded. And the first example I'm going to give you today is probably the most common of all MIDI control data types, and that's pitch bend. Now, pitch bend cannot be stored as automation. This is something that's very surprising to a lot of Cubase users when they ask if they can abandon MIDI entirely. The answer is no. There are certain elements of the MIDI protocol that basically work so well that no DAW has ever overwritten them. And pitch bend information is actually stored as MIDI data. And that means it's stored in the MIDI part. This is a crucial difference between automation and MIDI data. All MIDI data is stored in a MIDI part and cannot exist outside of that part. So you never store MIDI information on the track. That's why we have the lower window open here, because this is our view of the MIDI part. Okay, let's have a quick look at our test environment. I have an instance of a Juno synth up and running here. This is an Arturia emulation of the Juno 6. I'm going to use this for a few of our examples today. The first one, we don't actually need to see the synthesizer at all. I'm going to record pitch bend information. I've recorded a single C1 note here, so if I just press play, as simple as it gets. I'm going to overlay some MIDI data on top of this part, so I'm in mix mode here, so I can basically record as much information as I want into this MIDI part. So without further ado, let's get some pitch bend information recorded. You can't actually physically see me move the wheel, but it's over here, trust me. I'm basically just moving the pitch bend wheel up and down. Here goes. Up we go, back down to the middle, down to the lowest value, back up to the middle, and a little wobble at the end. If you look very carefully, you can actually see overlaid in the MIDI part very fine lines. If I zoom in a little bit, you can just about see them. That overlay is configurable. If we head into MIDI preferences, you want to go down to your event display MIDI section. These values here, the note brightness and the controller brightness, including the overall show controllers option, allow you to specify how those MIDI control events are represented in your MIDI parts. You can see they've just got nice and dark there. I don't like to have too bright overlays on the MIDI parts. It just makes the project too cluttered, but that's how you configure them anyway. Let's close that down. What we really want to see is the actual MIDI event data that we've recorded. This is a kind of visual overlay representation, but where's the data? Well, in the lower editor, we can add as many controller lanes as we want with this little plus symbol. These dark diamond symbols tell you what kind of MIDI information is actually recorded inside this MIDI part, and it's telling you, Cubase is telling you that it now has pitch bend information. So if I select pitch bend, here's the new controller lane, just been represented. And if I make that a bit bigger, now you can see there's the pitch bend wheel going up and then back down, and there's the wiggle at the end. That information is now baked into the MIDI part, and every time I play the part back, all of that information will be relayed in addition to the note information. Cubase does have the facility to show you the absolute truth of the information that's stored in a MIDI part. You head up into the MIDI toolbar item at the top of the program and select Open List Editor. This tells you every single MIDI event in the part and look at all of that pitch bend data. We have a single note and then everything else is pitch bend, and here are all of the exact values. Tiny little aside here, you can see all of these digital representations going down to 1,000th. The MIDI protocol itself deals in absolute numbers. The pitch bend information, for instance, is stored inside a 14-bit zone like a dedicated silo in the MIDI protocol, which means plus or minus 8,191 is the actual maximum values you can have. And this is Cubase's interpretation of that. We simply don't need to know that level of granularity. I kind of regret even saying it. But when you have a look at these values down here, you can see 48.578. It doesn't really matter. It's basically just up to maximum pitch bend and minimum pitch bend. And it's up to your synthesizer to then determine how to interpret that information. Now that we've recorded the information, it's editable in exactly the same way as note information is. I've just selected a range of control data there. If I press delete, it's gone. And you can see Cubase draws a diagonal line to represent the change from this pitch bend state up to this pitch bend state. And if I play back the note over that range, you'll hear the pitch bend slide up smoothly. That's Cubase doing a lot of heavy lifting in the background there. All we actually have are two separate MIDI events. If you had a look in the MIDI part, you would see these two separate individual MIDI events stating a specific pitch bend value. Cubase is interpreting that over the course of this gradient as lots of individual tiny little increments, taking care of all of that seamlessly for you. We even have the ability to draw parabolic curves. So very advanced editing. Cubase takes care of all of that complexity for us. We're only interested in hearing the pitch bend change. I can remove that MIDI controller lane by right-clicking in the left-hand bar and say remove the lane. That has not deleted the MIDI data. The MIDI data is still there. In fact, if I click the plus button, the diamond still represents that we have data. Bring the event lane back, and there it is. If I actually want to permanently delete that pitch bend data, the easiest way for me to do it is to head back over it to this control zone, right-click, select all events on lane, and delete. Press the delete key on my keyboard, and now it really has gone. So pitch bend is a specific dedicated MIDI event type baked into the MIDI protocol, absolutely sacrosanct and untouchable. Another completely independent MIDI event type is Aftertouch. Once again, that has its own entirely dedicated zone in the MIDI protocol that nothing else touches. And so once again, DAWs very rarely tread on that ground. They leave Aftertouch to the MIDI world. So if you want to record Aftertouch, you need to do it into the MIDI part. You can't store it as automation on the track. Let's have an example of Aftertouch in use. I'm going to dial up my Juno again, and for this case, you don't particularly need to understand how the synth works, but Aftertouch has actually been mapped to the filter control. So I'm going to press a note on the keyboard. Now I'm going to press into the Aftertouch zone. So it's like a spongy section underneath every key. So you press the key down to maximum velocity and then go further, deeper into the key. That's your Aftertouch zone. The vast majority of modern keyboards have Aftertouch now, but it does require your physical keyboard to actually implement this feature if you want to play it as a performance tool. And then different plugins have ways to assign that Aftertouch to a specific function. So with it being mapped to the filter cutoff, now I can record some Aftertouch information. Now this time, because I'm going to be pressing a note, I'm actually going to delete my original synth note, and I'll just re-record it as I'm playing with the Aftertouch. Here we go. So I've not pressed into the Aftertouch yet. Here goes. Where is it? Well, it's a controller lane. We need to make it visible. We can also take this pitch bend lane away as it happens because we don't have any pitch bend data anymore. Let's do both of those things. Firstly, right click on the pitch bend zone, remove the lane, don't need that one. Now I'm going to click the plus symbol. Here's my little Aftertouch diamond, and there's the Aftertouch as I recorded it. It's basically kind of pressing into the spongy bit of the key. If I replay that back, you'll hear that filter change. another completely dedicated, standalone section of the MIDI protocol designed specifically to do exactly that job. Let's get rid of all of that MIDI data, shall we? Right click, select all events, delete, and we're clean again. I can get rid of the Aftertouch channel lane, I should call it. Okay, onto channel type number 3, channel message type number 3. And here's the big one, because we're going to talk about continuous controller data now. So this MIDI protocol that I keep referring to that has these set aside silos, these dedicated storage areas for different kinds of information. The note has its own storage area, and that's where note on and note off information are stored. Note on is where the note begins, note off is when it ends. There's no concept of length in the MIDI protocol. Cubase works out the length from the difference between the on and the off. The note on information also stores the key's velocity, how loud that note's going to be played. Not interested in any of that today. We've dealt with pitch bend and aftertouch, other dedicated areas of the MIDI protocol. But the elephant in the room is the continuous controller zone. There are 127 dedicated storage areas in the MIDI protocol called continuous data, and they're numbered from 1 to 127. Technically speaking, they're all completely freely configurable, but by convention, some of them are reserved. And I will show you a couple of those reserved examples a little bit later. We're just going to stick with the Juno for now because that's where we are. Each one of these 127 slots is simply a storage data. It's actually a single byte of information. And the values that can be stored in these slots are plus or minus 127. And then we have a 0, and then there's an extra bit to determine whether or not it's a positive or a negative value. Add all of that up together and you get 256, which is a byte, 2 to the power of 8. I'm going to show you an example of continuous controller data being used on this Juno. Let's open the synthesizer again. We have all of these controls. Let's make it a bit simpler. There's the standard Juno. Every one of these sliders, knobs, buttons, controls has the ability to be mapped into Cubase so that I can manipulate those controls in real time. Every plugin will have its own different interpretation of how to do that. In the case of the Juno 6, we have this advanced screen on the right-hand side, which you can open. And in the MIDI section, you basically put it in learn mode. And you say, I want to map to the filter's frequency cutoff, which is this control here. Having selected it, I'm now going to move a control on my physical keyboard, which is going to output continuous controller data number 22. That's configured on my physical hardware. Now, it's beyond the remit of today to talk about how to configure your physical hardware. That's something you'll need to look into. But there will be a way for you to map every controller on your keyboard to a specific MIDI CC value, continuous controller. I just moved that control on my keyboard and you saw this value appear. There's my CC22 data. Come out of learn mode. And now this knob on my physical hardware has been mapped to the frequency control on the VCF, and you can see it going up and down. I can now record that MIDI data, that MIDI CC data, dynamically into Cubase. Now, there are two different ways that we can do that. One of them is automation. I refer you to my other video where I'm talking about automation specifically in order to record that, but automation is recorded at the track level. You would engage write automation in order to be able to do that. That's a different subject for a different day. The second option is to record the information as MIDI CC data in the MIDI part itself, and that's what we're going to do now. In order to record information into your MIDI part, as with the previous examples, you need to press record and bake that MIDI data into the part. So let's do it. So I'm now going to move this control on my keyboard, and there's me manipulating the filter cutoff in real time. So that's basically just turning that knob backwards and forwards. We now want to see that information. Let's open our controller lane and see what we see. Can you see that Cubase has added control 22 to that list? It wasn't there previously. It's now basically saying you've got some CC22 data in this MIDI part. Do you want to look at it? And of course the answer is yes. And there it is. Go back to the beginning, press play. If I open the synthesizer, you can see that control sliding up and down in response to this MIDI CC data. So that's been recorded into the MIDI part One final time, can't stress this enough, MIDI data has been stored in the MIDI part. Do you want to do some editing on it? No problem. Pick up some of the notes, do whatever you want with them, stretch them, tilt them. Control data can be manipulated in exactly the same way as any other kind of data in Cubase. They're all treated equally. Now, even though I'm trying to avoid getting too entangled in the whole concept of automation, I'm going to demonstrate how closely MIDI CC data and Cubase automation are related. They are extremely closely related. If I select this MIDI part and head back up into the MIDI menu, go down into Functions, and there's an option here called Extract MIDI Automation. What's going to happen there? Even the terminology is confusing. MIDI automation. Is it MIDI or is it automation? Is it one or the other? It's really a very fuzzy subject. What we have here is MIDI data, continuous controller data, that by selecting this function is going to be converted into automation data. Watch what happens when I execute this function. We now have a solid green line. The controller lane is telling you that there is a virtual representation of some CC22 data, but it's no longer stored inside the MIDI part, and so we can't edit this information at all. In fact, the information has now been thrown up onto the track level, and if I right click on the track and say Show Used Automation, as if by magic, our CC22 data reappears, but now it's automation data stored at the track level. If we hover over it, you can see that this automation is representing CC22 information. Now, if I want to get this information back to that synthesizer and have this control update in real time, I need to engage the automation features in Cubase. Responsibility for handling this information has been now passed up to the track level, and Cubase is going to take control. We engage automation by activating the read automation function, and now when I press play, there's the control going up and down, and there's me disabling read data, read automation, and now it's no longer responding to that information. So they are really closely related, and that's why it's so easy to get confused between the two. Just try to retain the idea of automation stored on the track, MIDI data stored in the MIDI part. That kind of helps to clarify the confusion. I'm going to throw this automation away now, but this will reveal a bug in Cubase when I do. I'm going to right click, I'm going to say remove selected track. That's just deleted that automation data, but look below. This representation is decoupled and Cubase isn't properly updating. It still looks like there's automation information here. There isn't. This is basically just like an orphan. And if we head back into the little plus symbol, you can see that there's no CC22 data there. Just a graphical bug, not too much to worry about. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of these reserved messages. CC22 is a freely available value for you to do whatever you want with, but if you tread on the toes of a reserved value, you might be breaking some of the functionality inside your plugin. I'll show you a couple of examples of that now. Firstly, we're going to have a look at CC4 data. In order to demonstrate this, I'm going to use a piano. So this is a keyscape piano. Doesn't really matter what I'm using, but it's configured to use CC4 sustain pedal data for use in its emulation of a piano. Got this nice simple piano line here. Let's just have a listen to it as it is. Really straightforward stuff. What I want to do is I want to sustain these longer notes so that they almost go to the end of each bar. I want them to be far longer than they actually are. If I was playing this on a piano, I would use the sustain pedal to accomplish that. I'm going to create myself a new MIDI controller lane, and 64 is one of the dedicated kind of set aside reserved slots. You can see that there are some pre-configured slots down here. Here's 64. You can configure this list to your heart's content with this little drop down controller lane setup function. If you choose that, you can say set up available controllers, pops up this box, and here is 64. You can select if you wanted 22, which was the example we were looking at before. I could add that into my permanently visible list of MIDI controller data. And here it is. But I'm going to deal with 64 data now, which is sustain pedal. Let's create myself a sustain pedal lane. Now I'm going to insert some MIDI CC 64 data into this lane, and I'm going to draw it in manually. Now at the beginning of the MIDI part, you can see the MIDI part's actually overhanging the area that I want to deal with, because before the notes actually begin, I'm just going to set the sustain pedal value to off. Now sustain pedal data CC64 is typically on or off, and the crossover point comes at literally halfway up this controller lane. So however big you make it, anything below 50% is going to be sustain pedal off, and above is going to be on. And you can be super relaxed about this stuff. All we need to do is to make sure that I press the sustain pedal down at some point while these notes are playing. And you can see I really didn't care anywhere in the length of this note. I'm pressing the sustain pedal down. That's job done. Now I want the sustain pedal to ring out until very nearly the end of the bar. And then I want to turn it off. As long as this event comes after this event, it doesn't matter by how much, you can zoom in nice and tight if it's really important to you to get this stuff as accurate as possible. So here's my pedal still off, here's my pedal now on, and I can basically just run down this MIDI part very quickly, virtually turning this pedal on and off. It's literally as simple as drawing in these little shapes. Now when I press play on this piece, those chords are going to be extended for much longer. The sustain pedal of the plugin is going to take over responsibility for elongating those notes. And I should have put an off in right at the very end here just to clean things up. If I didn't put that final event data in, then the sustain pedal would have basically been held on, and any subsequent notes that I played on bar 10 or whatnot would have that sustain pedal still ringing. You need to physically turn it off by inserting a new MIDI event information. So there's me manually adding something that I know as part of the MIDI protocol 64 is reserved for pianos, and pretty much all pianos will respond to CC64 data. And generally speaking, the best way to think about it is head into your available controllers lane and have a look down this list. And if you see anything that's called control or something very simple like general purpose, you're going to be absolutely fine. You're free to use all of those slots, treat them as if they're completely empty. But some of them, and there are a few very special messages right at the end. Can you see all of this? All note off, CC123. Leave that alone. That's one that Cubase actually uses. That's your emergency MIDI reset button. So don't mess with the stuff that's been reserved. You're just creating yourself trouble if you do. Pretty much every plugin, for instance, will have CC1 dedicated to modulation. If you want your modulation wheel to do the standard thing that's going to come with that plugin when you first use it, just take advantage of that. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. One final example I'm going to show you today. This is another reserved lane. This is CC4, another very important one. And this is used by drum machines, by drum plugins, because it controls your hi-hat foot down and up. Here we have an example of a simple riff that I dragged out of one of the stock kits. Which one was it? So this is the kit, which is one of the standard kits that come with a groove agent. So I drag this rhythm into Cubase. This is what it sounds like. Can you hear that hi-hat opening and closing? Let's focus in on this note. It's quite quiet, let's just make it a bit louder. That's a partially open hi-hat, and it's entirely dependent on the CC4 value that's being set. These two MIDI events down here are determining how open that hi-hat is. If I move to a different place in the MIDI part and click the same note, that's the hi-hat fully closed. So that's the foot entirely off the pedal, and now the two cymbals of the hi-hat are basically next to each other, and I'm making a closed sound. As soon as I move to the point in the song where the MIDI event is active, now the hi-hat is slightly open. If I drag these MIDI events down, now the hat will be more fully open. So this is a fully configurable CC data value, unlike the sustain pedal that we were dealing with earlier, that was either on or off. Now the hi-hat open is completely configurable, and the further I pull these MIDI events down, the more open the hi-hat sound is. So again, this is another example of plugins knowing this stuff. Pretty much all drum plugins are going to respond in exactly the same way. If you have a live kit with a closed and an open hi-hat configuration, it's going to respond to MIDI CC4 data, and it's going to respond in this way. So don't configure your hardware with a controller that's mapped into CC4 and ask it to do a different job. You're just going to be causing yourself trouble and losing functionality that's otherwise baked into these tools. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.